The Hubble Space Telescope is an orbiting observatory that was launched in 1990. Ground-based observations of the stars are limited because of the blurring effects of the Earth's atmosphere. But because the Hubble telescope is in orbit about 380 miles above the Earth, it can produce sharper images than telescopes on the surface. The Hubble Large Primary Mirror reflects light from space to a second mirror. The light bounces off this mirror and passes through a hole in the center of the primary mirror. Special equipment then records the picture. But after the telescope was launched, NASA engineers discovered that the primary mirror was not focusing correctly. In 1993, astronauts in the space shuttle were sent to repair the optics, a job that was made easier because the telescope was designed to be repaired in space. The crash of the stock market in October 1929 signaled the beginning of the Great Depression, the worst economic crisis of the 20th century. Everyone was selling, but no one was buying. Caught between bad loans that could not be repaid and nervous depositors who wanted to close their accounts, banks ran out of money and were forced to close. And businesses that needed credit to operate had to shut down. In 1933, the lowest point of the Depression, 1 of every 4 workers in America was unemployed, over 13 million people. American farmers by the thousands lost their farms because of falling prices for farm products. Several years of drought only made things worse for farmers in what came to be known as the Dust Bowl area of the country. Many farm families, forced from their homes, became migrant laborers in California. Jobless and homeless, huge numbers of Americans were thrown into extreme poverty. Charities set up soup kitchens and bread lines, but hunger and misery stalked the streets and countryside. Camps of homeless people sprang up in the vacant lots and open spaces of cities across America. These collections of shacks and tents were called Hoovervilles, after Herbert Hoover, the President of the United States when the Depression began. Frustrated and demoralized, many Americans took their protests to the streets, demanding government action. Franklin D. Roosevelt, elected president in 1932, promised a New Deal for the people. His administration started many programs designed to put people to work and bring the country out of the Depression. But the Depression did not end until after the United States entered World War II and began producing large quantities of war materials. NASA began the Space Shuttle project in 1972. The shuttle's ability to land like an airplane makes it easier and less expensive to land than earlier spacecraft, which splashed down at sea. The reusable spacecraft was designed to make up to 100 missions. The first manned space shuttle mission blasted off from Cape Canaveral in 1981. The shuttle Columbia carried United States astronauts John W. Young and Robert L. Crippen on a 54-hour orbital flight. The shuttle was carried back to Cape Canaveral on top of a modified 747 jumbo jet. Astronauts aboard later space shuttle flights have performed a variety of missions, including launching satellites, retrieving and repairing them, and conducting experiments in biology and other fields. Apollo 11 was the first space mission to land a human being on the moon. On July 16, 1969, astronauts Michael Collins, Edwin E. Aldrin Jr., and Neil A. Armstrong blasted off from Cape Kennedy, now called Cape Canaveral. The Apollo lunar landing mission used 2 spacecraft, a command module that stayed in orbit around the moon, and a lunar module that separated from the command module, landed the astronauts on the moon, and brought them back to the command module. On July 20th, 4 days after liftoff, Armstrong and Aldrin piloted the lunar module to a successful landing on a large flat area of the moon called the Sea of Tranquility.
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, 1.5 leap for mankind.
While on the moon, the astronauts set up scientific equipment and collected rocks and soil samples. They returned to Earth on July 24th. Edison was one of the greatest inventors and industrial leaders in history. Among his nearly 1,100 patents, the most ever issued to one person, are the phonograph, which became the first practical method of recording and playing back sounds, a motion picture camera and projector, and the incandescent lamp, an inexpensive and safe source of light for everyday use in homes. Among Edison's greatest achievements was the development of one of the first research laboratories. Here in Menlo Park and West Orange, New Jersey, Edison and his assistants developed thousands of inventions. Before the Berlin Wall was built in 1961, as many as 1,000 people a day emigrated from East Germany to escape communist rule and seek a better standard of living in the West. The East German government built the Berlin Wall to stop this tremendous drain of its people, many of whom were from its educated and professional classes. Berlin quickly became a divided city, first with barbed wire and then with massive stone walls. The wall did not stop everyone. Desperate escape attempts made many Cold War headlines. Some were successful, and some were not. Over 170 people died trying to cross the wall, most shot to death by border guards. During the 1970s and 80s, relations between East and West Germany improved slightly. In 1989, popular protests in East Germany against travel and emigration restrictions forced the East German government to open the wall. Most of the wall was torn down, but a few sections remain as memorials. After 4 years of work, including thousands of glider flights, Orville and Wilbur Wright built their first airplane, called the Flyer. Made mostly from wood and cloth and powered by a 12-horsepower engine, the plane had a control system that allowed the pilot to maintain wing balance during flight. Near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, in December 1903, Orville Wright piloted the Flyer in a 12-second, 120-foot flight, thus becoming the first person to successfully fly an engine-driven, heavier-than-air machine. As the Wrights continued their experiments, they made longer and longer flights. Henry Ford was the leading manufacturer of American automobiles in the early 1900s. He revolutionized the young automobile industry by developing the assembly line method of production. By manufacturing his own parts and developing a huge system of conveyors to bring the parts to the assembly line, Ford reduced the costs of manufacturing automobiles. And Ford passed on much of the savings created by assembly line production to his customers. In 1908, when the Ford Motor Company introduced the Model T, it cost $850. By 1924, assembly line innovations helped reduce the price of a Model T to $290. An automobile was now within reach of the average family. Classical ballet technique is based on the position of the legs called the turnout. This is the first of 5 positions. This is the second. Third. Fourth. And fifth. The plie, or bending of the legs, is the springboard for all movements. This pirouette from 4th position incorporates a plie. Point work, or dancing on the toes, is a special technique for women and requires great strength in the feet and ankles. Ballet uses these and numerous other positions and movements in a seemingly endless variety of combinations. In the floor exercise, the gymnast must perform a continuous series of movements that require flexibility, balance, and straight. On the pommel horse, the gymnast must support his weight entirely with his hands while performing a series of swinging maneuvers. This maneuver is known as the scissors. On the ring exercise, the gymnast must try to keep the rings motionless while he executes a number of difficult maneuvers with his body. The gymnast performs swings, handstands, and other movements on the parallel bars. He also does holding positions, which require him to remain motionless for 1 or 2 seconds. On the horizontal bar, the gymnast must perform acrobatic moves without coming to a stop. The exercise ends with a dismount. The uneven parallel bars event requires the gymnast to execute difficult maneuvers on both bars while in constant motion. On the balance beam, the gymnast tries to use the entire length of the beam. The advanced gymnast may perform somersaults, back handsprings, or floor exercise. The gymnast demonstrates her skills in acrobatics, tumbling, and dancing. Gymnasts are judged on the grace and difficulty of various maneuvers performed with equipment such as a ribbon, clubs, or hoop.
Adolf Hitler began his rise to political power in Germany in 1919, the year after World War I ended. The German Empire had been defeated and the nation's economy lay in ruins. He joined a small discussion group in the city of Munich. He soon became the group's leader and named the group the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The group became known as the Nazi Party. Hitler declared that the Nazi Party could restore the economy, provide jobs for all, and lead Germany to greatness again. He quickly built up party membership, partly by his ability to stir crowds with his speeches. On November 8, 1923, Hitler put this ability to the test. At a rally in a Munich beer hall, Hitler proclaimed a Nazi revolution, or putsch. The next day, he tried to seize the government of the German state of Bavaria in what became known as the beer hall putsch. Hitler was supported by more than 2,000 stormtroopers, members of the Nazi Party's private army. But the beer hall putsch failed. State police opened fire and stopped the procession. 16 marchers were killed. Hitler was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison. While in prison, he began writing the book he called Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. He was released from prison after less than a year and continued working on the book. Hitler and the Nazis did not gain wide support among Germans until the Great Depression began in 1929. This severe economic slump affected countries all over the world. Discontented Germans, fearing hunger and unemployment, began turning to the Nazi Party in increasing numbers. When elections were held in 1932, the Nazis emerged as Germany's strongest political party. Hitler was able to persuade Germany's president to name him chancellor, or head of the German government, even though the majority of the German people and the leading politicians did not want to see Hitler get that post. They feared that Hitler would make himself dictator and set up a reign of terror. On January 30th, 1933, Hitler took office and indeed quickly moved toward making himself Germany's absolute ruler. His government outlawed freedom of the press, labor unions, and all political parties except the Nazi Party. They set up concentration camps for anyone suspected of opposing the government. Jews and members of other minority groups were rounded up and imprisoned in these camps. There, they were killed or used as forced labor. Hitler built Germany into a powerful war machine. The Nazis held rallies that featured thousands of troops, and Hitler used these rallies to impress the German people and persuade them to accept his plan to establish Germany as the world's leading power. Hitler then sent his troops marching into Austria and Czechoslovakia, and next into Poland. When Hitler invaded Poland, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had begun.
Abraham Lincoln was President of the United States from 1861 to 1865. During this time, he kept the Union together during the Southern Secession and the Civil War, and brought about the end of slavery in the United States. Lincoln was born on the American frontier in a log cabin in Kentucky. At 7 years old, Abe moved to Indiana with his family. Bears and other wild animals roamed the forests. As in Kentucky, a log cabin provided shelter for the Lincolns in Indiana. Log cabins sheltered many Americans at that time and did not signify poverty. His family was as comfortable as most of their neighbors, and Abe was well fed and clothed. Abe's mother died in 1818 when he was 9. A year later, his father married Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow. Abe's new stepmother had 3 of her own children and brought them with her to the Lincoln cabin. Her arrival at the cabin ended the long months of loneliness that had followed the death of Abe's mother. Education was a problem for Abraham Lincoln on the frontier of 19th century America. Books and paper were scarce. Young Abe was an eager reader and learner, and he would walk long distances to borrow books. At night, he read by the light of the fireplace. Like other children of his time, Abe made his own arithmetic textbook, several pages of which still exist. Though Abraham Lincoln had less than a year of formal schooling, he continued studying throughout his life and educated himself. He went on to become a lawyer, a member of the United States House of Representatives, an outstanding writer and speaker, and of course, President of the United States.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected President of the United States 4 times, in 1932, 1936, 1940, and 1944. No other person has been elected more than twice. During his long presidency, Roosevelt led the United States through the economic depths of the Great Depression and the perilous times of World War II. To many people, Roosevelt, or FDR as the president was often called, was a symbol of great strength during those difficult times. Yet he himself had to overcome a severe physical weakness. He was born in Hyde Park, New York in 1882. In 1905, he married Eleanor Roosevelt, a distant cousin, and had 6 children, one of whom died in infancy. In 1921, he was struck with polio at his family's summer home. Damage to his legs was such that he was unable to stand or even move his legs. His back, arms, and legs became partially paralyzed. He could no longer hold a pen to write. But FDR fought back against the crippling disease. He regained use of his hands, and paralysis left his back. Many months of exercising with gymnasium equipment developed great strength in his arms and shoulders. He also swam regularly as a strengthening exercise. Roosevelt began trying to walk again despite several bad falls. His legs improved a little, but he never could walk unaided again or without leg braces. Before his polio attack, Roosevelt had been a New York State Senator, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and an unsuccessful 1920 Democratic candidate for Vice President of the United States. After the attack, Roosevelt devoted himself increasingly to politics, along with his exercises. In spite of his handicap, he became an energetic, tireless campaigner. He was elected governor of New York in 1928 and re-elected in 1930. In 1932, he began his unmatched string of 4 victories in presidential elections. Though confined to a wheelchair most of the time, the wheelchair was not visible in photographs or newsreels, and many Americans never even realized he was crippled. Many legendary stories exist about George Washington, the first president of the United States of America. One well-known story illustrating his honesty claims that George, as a child, chopped down a cherry tree. He then confessed the deed to his father, explaining, "I cannot tell a lie." These tales may have no basis in fact, but their existence illustrates the high regard in which Washington has been held throughout the history of the United States. The adult George Washington was described by one of his officers during the Revolutionary War as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Washington was called first in war because he was the military leader of the American colonial forces that defeated the British in the Revolutionary War from 1775 to 1783. He was first in peace because he became one of the chief leaders of a post-war group of men who created the unified nation of the United States of America. He presided over the Constitutional Convention of 1787, which created the Constitution of the United States. And he served as the first president of the new nation from 1789 to 1797. Because of his leadership, character, and contributions to the nation, he has been revered by Americans for more than 200 years, placing him first in the hearts of his countrymen. During his lifetime, some people even wanted to make Washington a king. Ever since the Revolutionary War, Washington's birthday has been celebrated throughout the country, and American school children have studied his life and deeds. The nation's capital was named after him, and he is the only president for whom a state was named. Washington's likeness appears on both the $1 bill and the quarter, and countless features such as towns, streets, and schools were named in his honor. Washington spent much of his life at Mount Vernon, his estate in Virginia, and he was buried there after his death in 1799.
The Great Barrier Reef is the largest group of coral reefs in the world and one of Australia's most popular tourist attractions. The reef is actually a broken chain of more than 2,500 reefs, which runs approximately 2,010 kilometres along the northeast coast of Australia. Many small islands are also scattered throughout the reef. The waters around the reef remain warm all year. These warm waters and the beauty of the coral formations attract large numbers of swimmers and skin divers to the reef. The coral that forms the Great Barrier Reef is made of hardened skeletons of dead water animals called polyps. Billions of living coral polyps from approximately 400 different species are attached to the reef. Among these species are the staghorn coral, brine coral, honeycomb coral, leaf coral, table coral, and mound coral. The polyps come in a rainbow of colours, including blue, green, purple, red, and yellow. In addition to the coral polyps, the reef supports a fascinating variety of life, including about 1,500 species of fish. These include angelfish, cod, manta rays, mackerel, butterfly fish, and surgeonfish. Crabs, giant clams, shrimps, crayfish, sea urchins, sea stars, sea cucumbers, sea fans, sponges, sea anemones, and sea turtles are just a few of the other animals that live on the reef.
Pearl Harbor is a sheltered harbor on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. During the early 1900s, it became a base for the United States Navy. In the 1930s, Japan, controlled by military leaders, became increasingly aggressive against its Asian neighbors, invading and occupying Manchuria and part of China. The United States called for an end to the aggression, but Japanese troops invaded southern Indochina in July 1941. In response, the United States cut off its exports to Japan. On December 7, 1941, top diplomats from the United States and Japan met in Washington, D.C., trying to work out differences between the two countries. But at the same time, about 360 Japanese airplanes took off from aircraft carriers in the Pacific and bombed the American military facilities at Pearl Harbor. This surprise attack, or sneak attack as it was widely called, resulted in about 2,400 American deaths and about 2,000 wounded. It destroyed or damaged 21 American ships and more than 300 airplanes. The United States declared war on Japan the following day, December 8, 1941. In his declaration speech, President Franklin D. Roosevelt called December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Remember Pearl Harbor became the rallying cry of the American war effort against Japan. It showed up everywhere, including license plate attachments and postcards. Americans wore jewelry and pinback buttons that urged, "Remember Pearl Harbor." In 1945, after a long struggle, the United States and its allies defeated Japan and Nazi Germany, Japan's ally. One of the vessels sunk during the Pearl Harbor attack was the battleship USS Arizona. The sunken ship was left almost completely submerged in the harbor with more than 1,000 men entombed in it. A memorial was built over the ship. Visitors to the room-like memorial can see part of the Arizona. They can also see oil still slowly leaking from the Arizona to the surface of the water. An oil bubble, about the size of a large marble, comes to the surface every 20 to 30 seconds. Animals of the deserts have developed special bodies and ways of life that enable them to survive in extreme heat. Many desert dwellers have light-colored skin, which helps keep them cool by reflecting sunlight. These animals include desert foxes, jackrabbits, and various kinds of snakes. Desert foxes have long ears. When overheated, these animals move to a cool cave or burrow where they can get rid of excess body heat through their ears. Centipedes, kangaroo rats, rattlesnakes, and scorpions spend the day in burrows. They come out to search for food when temperatures drop at night. Some snails, lizards, and ground squirrels estivate or sleep through the summer. Some animals have developed more unusual ways to cope with the desert climate. For example, the Cape ground squirrel makes its own shade by using its bushy tail like a parasol. Fairy shrimp and spadefoot toads may spend months or years underground, waiting for rain to create ponds. They then quickly feed and reproduce before the ponds dry again. All animals of the desert must drink water, which is often in short supply. They obtain water from plants, small ponds, and from the animals they eat.